Hi, this is Mr. Carvajal for English 1. And if you were absent on Wednesday, you missed the start of our test, our multi genre unit reading summative exam. And you want to be able to have read in advance so you can do your best on the test. And that's what this video is here for. So I'm glad you're here. Remember, you are strong, confident, and successful. Focus in, pay attention, read along, and you'll go a long way towards passing this test. So it's a test with two different readings: fiction, story, narrative, and a nonfiction informational writing. And we're going to focus on the fiction first, the hike. And let's look at the question that we're being asked here. In the hike, what does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arseno? Or maybe he's Hispanic, Arsenio, I'm not sure, but we'll call him Mr. Arseno. Support your answer with evidence from the selection. Use the space provided for planning. Write your response in the box. And of course, we're focused on what the narrator reveals, not what they tell us at the beginning, but what they show us throughout the story. Something happens that you notice, you see about Mr. Arseno, and as we read, be looking for that. So let's switch to the reading, the hike, and let's get started. No one, oh, yeah, no one ever looked forward to summer vacation more than Emily Arsenault. Every July, after waiting an interminable month after school was out, Emily and her family, which included her parents and two brothers, would go camping. Or, as her father liked to say, they would pack up the wagon and head for the hills. The truth of the matter was that the wagon was their 8-year-old SUV, and the hills were the Rocky Mountains. The trip was a tradition that began before Emily was born, although she was never quite sure how or why it had taken root in the Arsenault family. Her father, while one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet, was not what you would call a mountain man. Setting up the tent alone could take the better part of a day, and even then they were lucky if it didn't collapse on them with the slightest breeze. When Emily was little, having her family all to herself in the mountains was heavenly. However, as she and her brothers, Zach and Bo, got older, that began to change. Being stuck for a week with their parents was no longer their idea of fun. Zach, who had never been a fan of the whole camping experience, was the first to bring it up. Initially, he tried to be subtle. When that approach didn't work, he became a little bolder. Nothing personal, Mom, Zach complained loudly one day about a month before the trip, but I'm pretty sure that a week of forced imprisonment with only Emily and Bo for company is against the United States Constitution. Suppressing a smile, Mrs. Arsenault ignored her son's comment, but it planted an idea in her mind that she decided to discuss with her husband later that night. What if they were to have another family join them on their vacation? When the idea was disseminated among the Arsenault clan, all concurred that it was indeed a great plan. They were even able to agree on which family they'd like to ask: the McGees. Not only did Rachel and Ed McGee have children in the same age range as Emily and her brothers, but they too loved the outdoors. Emily knew this because she had heard Mr. McGee speak often. Actually, it was very close to bragging about his great adventures. In some of the stories, he was leading a group of explorers to safety along the Amazon. Once, he said, he had to dig an ice cave for protection from a sudden blizzard while climbing some distant mountain range. Emily wasn't sure why Mr. McGee had been in such situations because he was a mechanical engineer and adventure wasn't part of the job description. She never said anything about her suspicions, though, because her dad's job wasn't much more exciting than Mr. McGee's. As a writer, Mr. Arsenault made up most of his adventures, too. Soon the time came to depart for their week in the mountains. As the two families caravanned into the Rockies, they noticed that there was still snow on the peaks. With that, it was decided that as soon as their camp was set up, they would climb the nearest mountain and have a snowball fight. Immediately, Emily was worried about how her dad's mountain man skills would stack up against Mr. McGee's. After lunch, Mr. Arsenault asked the group who wanted to hike. Mrs. Arsenault and Mrs. McGee decided to stay back at the campsite and make sure none of the forest critters got into the supplies. The 6 Arsenaults and McGee children and their fathers put on the hiking boots and warm jackets, gathered some climbing gear, and were ready to set out on their adventure. Before the climbing party left the campground, however, Mr. McGee decided to give them a tutorial on geometry of mountain climbing. As the mountain becomes steeper, he explained, the most efficient way to scale it is to go straight up. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, he said. Apparently, climbing a straight line requires a lot of stuff, because by the time the group left, Mr. McGee had so much gear hanging off of him, Emily was amazed he could put one foot in front of the other. Emily's father just nodded as Mr. McGee spoke. In all the years the Arsenaults had been camping, he'd made it clear that the point of being there was to have fun. As Emily watched her father, she was pretty sure he wasn't having any fun. Once Mr. McGee had exhausted his knowledge of mountain climbing, the group set out. The first part was relatively easy, with gentle rises that were easily traversed. But soon the easy parts gave way to rockier elevations. That's where the hard work began. Before Emily knew it, Mr. McGee was swinging a treble hook, aiming approximately 20 yards straight up the sheer mountainside, and instructing the rest of them to pull themselves up the rope to a point where the hook held firm. They were then to throw the hook up another few yards, and pull up again until they reached their destination. Mr. Arsenault looked at his children's faces, which were alternately looking up and down the mountain, clearly measuring the distance a person would fall if the rope didn't hold. He knew what they were thinking, so he casually said, "You know, Ed, I think my kids and I will take the trail around the side of the mountain and meet you at the top." "Okay," said Mr. McGee with great hesitation, "but it will take you much longer because, as you know—" "Yes, we know," interrupted Emily's dad. "The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line." Mr. McGee nodded, gave a small snort, and began harnessing his daughter, Megan, into the elaborate climbing gear. "I tell you what," said Mr. Arsenault, "if it takes us a lot longer to get to the top, you and your kids should just keep going, and we'll see you on your way back down the mountain." All agreed that this is how they would proceed, and off they went. Before long, Emily, her father, and brothers had walked a challenging path up the side of the mountain. Along the way, they spotted an old mine shaft, which their dad wouldn't let them enter due to safety concerns. But just outside its opening, they saw something. Buried in the dirt behind some undergrowth was an antique button-hook boot. Though admitting he was no expert in such things, Mr. Arsenault estimated the footwear to be at least 100 years old. The Arsenault crew didn't tarry long at the mine shaft because they were concerned that the McGees would have already reached the destination, and they didn't want them to have to wait any longer than necessary for them. As Emily and her father climbed further up the mountain, the sun began going down in the sky. Almost 2 hours after starting the hike, the Arsenaults arrived at the predetermined destination. It wasn't the highest peak on the mountain, but there was enough snow on it for a snowball fight. Now all they required was an opponent. They scanned the rocky bluffs around them, but Mr. McGee and his kids were nowhere to be seen. "They probably got tired of waiting and headed down the mountain a different way," said Mr. Arsenault resignedly. It was clear to Emily that somewhere in the recesses of her father's mind, he had hoped they would have beaten the other group to the top. "Let's start back," said Mr. Arsenault. But before they had taken a single step, they heard the sound of voices. It was the McGees, slowly pulling themselves by the rope up to the peak, where Emily, Beau, Zach, and Mr. Arsenault were already standing. The Arsenault children were tempted to gather snowballs and surprise the latecomers as they topped the ridge, but Emily's dad made it clear with one look that he didn't approve of such an idea. She knew, as her father knew, that the length of time it took them to get to the top was embarrassing enough for Mr. McGee, without getting a face full of snow, too. Being the last person in his family to reach the place where the Arsenault family stood, Mr. McGee looked at them in stunned silence before bursting into laughter. Although they got off to a rocky start, by the end of the week, everyone was having a good time. The summer camping trip was more enjoyable than ever, and both families had learned a valuable lesson. While it may be true that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, it's not always the fastest, or as Mr. McGee added, the most fun. All right, so think about this question again. What does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arsenault, right? That's Emily's dad. He's the one that said, let's take the side route. Let's go a different way. Let's not do it Mr. McGee's way. So think about what we read. Remember to use the key words. The narrator, what does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arsenault in your answer? Support your answer with evidence from the selection. And then we're ready to move on to the next one.